The gray granite, covered in lichen spots, holds a silence that seems heavier than the stone itself. Here, at the very edge of the earth, where the Barents Sea beats against the rocks with leaden waves, time flows differently. If you close your eyes and listen, through the whistling Arctic wind, you can discern the echo of events that forever changed this landscape. This is not just the northern tundra, it is the arena of one of the most incredible confrontations in human history. Imagine a place where the front line froze, as if embedded in ice for many years, where an enemy who conquered half of Europe in a matter of weeks could not advance even a few hundred meters. This is the story of the Rybachy Peninsula, a granite battleship that did not budge, and of the people whose will proved stronger than polar basalt. On June 22, 1941, the polar day was in full swing. The sun does not set below the horizon here, creating the illusion of eternal light. But this light was deceptive. While explosions were already thundering and cities collapsing on the western borders of the vast country, here, in the far north, an ominous silence reigned. But strategic maps in headquarters had already been drawn. The German command perfectly understood the geography of the region. Their gaze was fixed on Murmansk, the only ice-free port in the north, which was key to communications with the outside world. The capture of this city would mean the complete isolation of the Soviet Union, cutting off the oxygen artery through which Lend-Lease supplies would later flow. And the path to Murmansk lay through the Musta-Tunturi ridges and the isthmuses leading to the Sredny and Rybachy peninsulas. In the plans of the German command, the operation to capture Murmansk was named Silberfuchs, Silver Fox, a beautiful, predatory, and swift name, like the Blitzkrieg tactic itself. To accomplish this task, the elite Mountain Troops Corps Norway, under the command of General Eduard Dietl, was allocated. These were not just Wehrmacht soldiers, they were the best of the best. Jaegers, who had undergone rigorous training in the Alps, conquerors of Narvik, people who knew how to fight in mountains and snow. They were equipped with the latest technology. Their confidence in victory was absolute. They believed that the harsh nature of the North would become their ally, and Soviet troops, lacking such experience in mountain warfare, would be swept away by the first blow. But history loves paradoxes, and it was here, at the edge of the world, that the German war machine encountered an obstacle that was not marked on any topographical map. This obstacle was not geographical, but spiritual in nature. When the offensive began on June 29, 1941, it seemed that the plans of the Silver Fox were being implemented with German punctuality. The Jaegers crossed the border and rushed forward. Their goal was to cut off the Rybachy and Sredny peninsulas from the mainland, block the Soviet grouping, and open a direct path to Murmansk. The strike was powerful, professional, and calculated to the second. However, in the very first hours of the offensive, something went wrong. The terrain, which looked like passable tundra on maps, turned out to be a chaos of rock formations, boulders, and swamps. Equipment got stuck, horses broke their legs, and the advance of the infantry slowed down. But the main surprise was the resistance. On the Musta-Tunturi Ridge, a black and gloomy mountain rising above the tundra, Soviet border guards and rifle regiment soldiers met the enemy with such dense and furious fire that the elite Jaegers were forced to take cover. It was here, on the Musta-Tunturi Ridge, that time stopped. This is the only section of the Soviet Union's state border that the enemy was never able to overcome throughout all the years of confrontation. Border marker A36 remained in its place, becoming a symbol of unyielding spirit. The Germans managed to capture part of the ridge, the commanding heights, but they failed to throw the defenders into the sea. A positional war began, one that history had never known before. The distance between the enemy's trenches was sometimes only 25 or 30 meters. The audibility was such that one could distinguish the clinking of a spoon against a mess tin in the enemy's trench, hear foreign speech, and smell tobacco. Two armies froze into the stone, looking each other in the eye for more than 1,200 days and nights. The outer layer of this conflict was obvious: the struggle for territory, for height, for control over the entrance to the Kola Bay. The Rybachy Peninsula hung over the sea lanes like a huge, unsinkable cruiser. Whoever possessed Rybachy controlled the entrance to the port. German artillery, mounted on the mainland, shelled the peninsulas, trying to suppress the Soviet batteries. Soviet artillerymen responded in kind, covering Allied convoys heading to Murmansk. It was a duel of heavy guns, whose roar echoed over the sea for tens of kilometers. The rocks trembled, and it seemed that the granite itself groaned in pain. Shells could not burrow into the ground. There was no soil here, only solid rock. When a shell hit, stone fragments became as damaging an element as shrapnel, multiplying the destructive effect. But behind this external, visible confrontation lay a second, much deeper layer, an internal, human conflict. The conditions of existence on Rybachy and Sredny were beyond human capabilities. There was no rear in the usual sense here. Every square meter was under fire. It was impossible to dig a trench or a dugout. A shovel was powerless against granite. Shelters had to be built upwards, stacking breastworks from boulders, or carved into the rock using explosives and picks. People lived in stone sacks, where dampness was a constant companion. In summer, they were tormented by swarms of midges and mosquitoes, from which there was no escape. In winter, the polar night set in, when the sun did not appear for months and the temperature dropped below 30 degrees. With gale-force winds that turned the frost into unbearable torture. The psychological pressure was colossal. Imagine living in constant twilight or darkness, when the sky is illuminated only by flashes of the aurora borealis, resembling ghostly fire and bursts of explosions. The feeling of isolation was absolute. Supplies to the peninsulas came only by sea, at night, on small vessels, the _0_ boats and cutters, which broke through storms and minefields. Every can of preserves, every cartridge, every letter from home was delivered at risk to life. Vitamin deficiency led to scurvy, but the spirit of the fighters did not break. On the contrary, in these inhuman conditions, a special brotherhood was formed, cemented by a common understanding. There was nowhere to retreat. Behind them was the icy sea. Surrendering positions would mean betraying not only the country, but also comrades standing shoulder to shoulder. Here, among the rocks, a transformation of consciousness took place. Ordinary people, fishermen, workers, teachers, turned into warriors with unique skills. The phenomenon of sniper warfare in the tundra emerged. Camouflage became the art of survival. A fighter had to merge with the stone, become part of the moss, dissolve into the gray landscape. One careless movement, one glint of optics, and life ended. The Germans, despite their training and equipment, faced an enemy who knew how to wait, endure, and strike where they were not expected. The scouts of the Northern Fleet became a legend. Their raids deep into the enemy's rear, landings on enemy-occupied coastlines, terrorized the Jaeger troops. These men operated in conditions that German regulations considered impossible for combat operations. The third layer of the conflict, ideological and philosophical, was, perhaps, the most dramatic. It was a clash of two systems, two worldviews. On one side, technology, order, racial theory, a conviction in the superiority of the Aryan spirit over nature and inferior races. The mountain rangers had better equipment, insulated tents, spirit stoves, specialized rations, mountaineering gear. They built permanent fortifications, laid cable cars to deliver ammunition to the heights, creating comfort even in hell. On the other side, the Soviet soldier, often clad in a simple greatcoat and valenki, felt boots, armed with a Mosin rifle, but possessing something that could not be measured in calories or armor thickness. This was the ability for self-sacrifice and incredible ingenuity. The paradox was that the Germans' technical superiority was shattered by the natural quick wit and resilience of the peninsula's defenders. The Germans tried to conquer nature, to subject it to their rules of war. Soviet soldiers learned to live with nature in symbiosis, to use the peculiarities of the landscape, weather, and polar night as their weapons. When German equipment failed in the cold, Russian resourcefulness found a way out. When German night vision devices, and the first samples were already appearing among the Rangers, went blind in a blizzard, the hearing and intuition of the Pomors, coastal dwellers, and Siberians allowed them to detect the enemy. It was a confrontation of logic and spirit, calculation and improvisation. The Germans called this sector of the front the end of the world, a place of exile where the very land was hostile. For Soviet soldiers, it was their native land, albeit harsh and inhospitable, but their own, which could not be surrendered. The turning point in this frozen war did not ripen immediately. Years of positional confrontation exhausted both sides. However, by the autumn of 1944, the situation had changed dramatically. The overall strategic situation on the fronts of World War II was not in Germany's favor. The Soviet Union had accumulated strength, experience, and resources for decisive actions. In the north, the Petsamo-Kirkenes operation was being prepared. The task was ambitious, not just to contain the enemy, but to break through its defenses, which the Germans had been fortifying for over 3 years. The mountain rangers had turned the Musta Tunturi ridge and the approaches to Petsamo into an impregnable fortress. Pillboxes carved into the rocks, minefields, rows of barbed wire, every meter of space pre-sighted. The German command was confident. Storming these positions head-on was madness. But it was precisely this madness that became the plan of the Soviet command. A transformation occurred in their minds. From defense, from the psychology of not a step back, the army shifted to the psychology of victors. A daring plan was developed, including a simultaneous frontal assault and flanking maneuvers from the rear, as well as amphibious landings. The key element was the factor of surprise and the use of difficult weather conditions, which the enemy considered an obstacle. The autumn tundra, slippery rocks, freezing rain with snow, all this was to cover the movement of troops. Preparations were carried out in strict secrecy. Soldiers trained to storm rocks, overcome wire obstacles, and operate in the dark. The climax came in October 1944. An artillery barrage of such power began that these ancient rocks had never seen before. The roar of the cannonade drowned out the sound of the stormy sea. Thousands of shells rained down on German fortifications, exploding stone and concrete. And then the infantry and Marines went on the assault. It was not just a battle, it was an ascent of a vertical under fire. Soldiers clambered up the sheer slopes of Musta Tunturi, clinging to rock ledges, helping each other up. The Germans, stunned by the audacity of the attack, put up fierce resistance. The battle was for every crevice, for every boulder. During these hours, the fate of the entire northern flank was being decided. The intensity of passions reached its limit. There were moments when soldiers ran out of ammunition and they resorted to rifle butts, knives, and stones. Heroism became a mass phenomenon, but not the pathetic, bookish kind. It was a heavy, working heroism. People sacrificed themselves to block the embrasure of a pillbox and give their comrades a few seconds for a dash. Scouts landed behind enemy lines on the coast, cut communications, sowing panic and chaos in German headquarters. The famous landing in the port of Leonakamari became a model of tactical mastery. Boats broke through the narrow mouth of the fjord under crossfire from batteries, landing soldiers directly on the piers. The swiftness and onslaught were such that the vaunted defense of the mountain corps crumbled. By the end of October 1944, the territory was completely cleared of the enemy. The impregnable wall collapsed. The enemy was driven back to Norway, and then utterly defeated in this region. The threat to Murmansk was finally eliminated. The northern sea route and Allied convoys were safe. That very section of the border, marker A36, remained a symbol that even the most powerful war machine can be stopped by will and courage. 3 years of defense and several weeks of rapid offensive, such was the outcome of the battle for the Soviet Arctic. But what remains for us, living decades after these events? The lessons of Rybachy's defense extend far beyond military history. This is a story about human capabilities, about how adaptation and spirit are more important than technology, about how even in the most hopeless conditions, when you are pressed between an icy ocean and a granite wall, you can not only endure, but also win. The modern world, full of comfort and technology, often forgets what a person is capable of when deprived of everything but a goal. Rybachy reminds us, external circumstances, however harsh they may be, do not determine the outcome. The outcome is determined by what is within. Today, the Rybachy Peninsula is a place of pilgrimage. Tourists in SUVs traverse the very passes where cannons were once dragged by hand. Nature slowly but surely heals the wounds. Rusty barbed wire is overgrown with moss, shell casings turn to dust, concrete pillboxes crumble in the wind, but the scars on the earth remain. Explosion craters have become lakes. Trenches, streams. There is a special resonance here. This place does not let go. Standing on the top of Musta Tunturi and looking at the endless sea, you understand the scale of what happened. Here, not just armies clashed, but epochs clashed. Silence has returned to these lands, the same silence that was there on June 22nd, 41, but now it is filled with a different meaning. It is the silence of memory. The wind still whistles in the crevices, the waves still beat against the shore, but the stones now are not just geology. They are monuments. History has come full circle. From the anxious anticipation of war to fierce resistance, and finally, to the eternal peace of the victors. The defense of Rybachy is proof that there is nothing stronger than human determination to defend one's home, even if that home is a cold rock on the edge of the ecumene. And as long as we remember this, the granite battleship continues its eternal voyage in the ocean of time, undefeated and proud. Everyone who steps on this land today involuntarily slows down. Underfoot, it's not just gravel crunching, but history. Strange, unnatural landforms attract attention. These are not the whims of a glacier, but traces of man-made explosions. The entire surface of the isthmus is riddled, disfigured, plowed over with metal. It is estimated that the density of fire here was one of the highest in all of World War II. For every square meter, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of kilograms of lead and steel. If one tried to collect all the metal lying in this earth, it would require trainloads. And this metal lies intermingled with bones. Search parties still find the remains of soldiers, returning names from oblivion. Delving deeper into the details of those years, one is struck by the logistics of survival. How was water delivered to the peaks where there were no sources? In winter, they melted snow and ice, but what about summer? In summer, water was carried in thermoses on their backs, under fire. Every liter was valued like gold. How did they keep warm if there was no firewood? The tundra is scarce on fuel. Driftwood washed ashore by the sea, peat, and coal, which was delivered from the mainland with great difficulty, were used. Smoke from a potbelly stove could give away a position, so they learned to burn smokelessly, to mask the heat. Everyday life in war is a separate front. The struggle for cleanliness, for dry footcloths, for hot food. All this required no less effort than shooting. And in this everyday life, the care of commanders for soldiers and of soldiers for each other was manifested. The Marines played a special role in the defense. Black Devils, that's what the Germans called them for the color of their uniform and their fearlessness. In conditions where ordinary infantry tactics did not work, the sailors brought their spirit, their audacity. Attacks in Telnyashkas, which they put on before a decisive battle, instilled a mystical horror. The psychological effect of seeing men going into attack without stooping, despising danger, was devastating. The Germans wrote in their diaries about the quote one of the Russians, not understanding that behind this was not barbarism, but a conscious choice. Better an end than dishonor. One cannot forget the role of aviation. The sky over Rybachy was also a battlefield. Pilots of the Northern Fleet fought in the most difficult weather conditions. Taking off from icy airfields, fighting in clouds, landing in fog. This was daily work. The legendary Boris Safonov and his comrades covered the peninsula from the air, preventing German bombers from indiscriminately flattening the defenders' positions. Air battles here were fleeting and brutal. Falling into the icy sea or into the rocks, there was practically no chance of rescue. But the pilots rose into the sky again and again, defending this patch of land. The fact of interaction with allies is also interesting. British pilots, based on the Kola Peninsula, also contributed to the protection of convoys and the sky over Murmansk. This was a unique brotherhood in arms, when people of different languages and cultures united against a common enemy. They saw how the Russians fought on Rybachy, and this evoked deep respect in them. Lend-Lease, about which historians argue so much, took concrete forms here. Canned stew, trucks, Hurricane and Kitty Hawk aircraft. But no amount of equipment could replace a man in a trench on the Musta Tunturi rock. Equipment was only a tool in the hands of those who decided to stand to the end. Among the defenders of the peninsula were people of many different nationalities. The entire Soviet Union in miniature held the defense on these rocks. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, Tatars, Jews. There was no division by blood here. There was only division into their own and enemies. Common misfortune and a common goal united them more strongly than any slogans. In the letters home that miraculously survived, there is little pathos. There are simple questions. How are things with potatoes? Is Mom alive? Send warm socks. And at the end, a postscript. I will return with victory. Many did not return, remaining eternal guardians of the North. It is important to understand that the defense of Rybachy was not just static trench sitting. It was an active defense. Constant sorties, reconnaissance in force, artillery duels did not allow the enemy to relax for a minute. The Germans were forced to keep significant forces here that could have been transferred to other fronts, for example, to Stalingrad or Leningrad. Pinning down the elite units of the Norway Mountain Corps, this was the strategic contribution of the defenders of the Arctic to the common victory. Every day that the Rangers spent in fruitless attempts to break through the defenses on Musta Tunturi was a day won for the whole country. And so, returning in thought to that October of '44, one understands what a spring was released at that moment. The anger accumulated over 3 years, the pain of losses, the thirst for justice. All this burst out in a single impulse. The offensive was irresistible. Eyewitnesses recalled that even the wounded refused to leave the battlefield, striving to move forward. It was a catharsis, a cleansing of the land from invaders. When the Soviet flag rose over the heights, it was a sign not just of military victory, but of the triumph of life over oblivion. Today, when we look at the map of Russia, the Rybachy Peninsula looks like a small projection into the ocean. But if you know its history, this projection seems like a gigantic bastion. It teaches us that there are no small sections of the front, no insignificant battles. Every meter of native land matters, and every person who stood up to defend it becomes a figure of historical scale. The memory of Rybachy must live not only in textbooks and museums, but also in the minds of new generations. It is an inoculation against weakness, against despondency, against disbelief in one's own strength. A trip to Rybachy today is a test for equipment and spirit, even in peacetime. Roads, in essence, are absent. There are only directions. The weather changes every 15 minutes. Sun, rain, snow, fog. This allows one to feel, if only to a small extent, what the soldiers felt then. But we have warm jackets, GPS navigators, and the certainty that we will return to warmth in the evening. They did not have that. They had only faith and duty. And this chasm between our experience and their reality makes us bow our heads in silent respect. Concluding the story about this amazing place, I want to once again turn to the image of stone. Granite is a symbol of eternity. People come and go, but rocks remain. But the rocks of Rybachy and Musta Tunturi are now forever imbued with human history. They witnessed how high the human spirit can rise. And as long as these rocks stand, as long as the waves of the Barents Sea wash their bases, the history of the feat will not be forgotten. It is dissolved in the air, in the water, in the very space of the Russian north. This is a place of power, where everyone can touch eternity and understand something important about themselves and the world. The legacy of Rybachy's defense is also relevant in a geopolitical sense. The Arctic is once again becoming an arena of interests for different countries. The northern sea route, shelf resources, all this attracts attention. And the experience of defending the northern borders, gained then in the 40s, is invaluable. It reminds us that the North does not forgive mistakes and weakness, but rewards those who are steadfast and true to themselves. Rybachy stands as a sentinel, reminding everyone, these borders are reliably protected not only by modern weapons, but also by the memory of those who did not retreat a single step. This is the foundation on which security and sovereignty are built. Ultimately, the history of the defense of the Rybachy Peninsula is a hymn to life. Life that breaks through stone, like the polar poppy blooming in the wind. It is an affirmation that light always conquers darkness, even if that darkness lasts half a year of polar night. And each of us, facing our life's difficulties, can remember the garrison of the granite battleship and find the strength within ourselves not to give up, to stand to the end and win. For if they could stand there at the edge of the earth, then we too can overcome our trials. This is the main lesson that the Rybachy Peninsula transmits to us through time. Concluding this narrative, we leave the peninsula in its majestic solitude. The sound of the wind, the cries of seagulls, and the roar of the surf, these are the sounds that now dominate here. But in this noise, a keen ear will always distinguish the voices of the past, whispering, "We stood firm. We could. Remember us." And we remember. History continues, but its pages, written on the granite of Rybachy, remain among the brightest and most poignant. It is an eternal lighthouse of courage whose light will never fade.